So this morning, Amira read to us the story that is traditionally known as Doubting Thomas. That's his nickname. That's what we know him as. We know him for his doubts. And he's been used as a negative example throughout much of Christian history, as in, oh, don't be a doubting Thomas. But I wonder if there are things that religion has taught us that we should doubt. I wonder if some doctrines within Christian history have very little to do with Jesus and are actually quite harmful to our souls. I have been through a process of doubting some of those teachings within our Christian tradition. And in this sense, I love Doubting Thomas, and I think he's actually an excellent example of faith. Here's what I mean. Throughout much of my life, I was given the impression that religion was primarily about trying to be a good person. The larger Christian culture taught me this lesson. I had to believe the right things and behave the right way, and if I didn't, well, God's wrath would descend upon me, and God would send me straight to the fiery pits of hell. So the teaching said, don't be a doubting Thomas. Squelch all of your doubts. Keep your doubts inside of yourself. Don't admit them to anyone else. Keep your life in order. Obey God and God's commandments, because if you turn against God, God will turn against you. There were times in my life that I have lived in fear and anxiety about this God of hell. I was not at peace with God. God seemed much more like a distant, violent, and angry tyrant to be feared than a patient and compassionate parent to be loved. Did you notice in our passage today that when the resurrected Jesus appeared to the disciples, that they too were living in fear? Their master, Jesus, had just been killed, and they feared that those who killed Jesus might now come after them. And to make matters worse, suddenly and mysteriously, the man that they had just abandoned and betrayed, the man who was killed on the cross, was somehow present, standing in their midst, right in front of them. And then Jesus says what I think are the four most important and powerful words in all of Scripture. The resurrected Jesus gently says to the disciples, "Peace be with you." He doesn't just say those words once. He repeats them. Peace be with you. Peace be with you. Peace be with you. Why? Why did Jesus have to repeat those words 3 times? I think it's because the disciples had a hard time believing in Jesus' words of peace. The disciples lived in fear that other people were out to get them, and more immediately in this story, fear that the resurrected Jesus might be out to get them for revenge. The disciples acted badly. They all abandoned Jesus. They lacked faith. So they feared that they had turned against God and that God would turn against them. If Jesus followed the script of the wrathful God of hell that I grew up with, he would not have offered them peace. According to that script, Jesus should have said something like, "Hey, you jerks." And then he would have done his best Arnold Schwarzenegger impersonation and say, "I'm back. And I'm sending you all to hell because you lack faith and you abandoned me, so now I will abandon you." But that's not at all what Jesus says. He says to them, "Peace, peace, peace be with you." Jesus doesn't abandon them. In fact, even though the disciples lacked faith in him, Jesus continued to have faith in his disciples. He didn't give up on them. Rather, he sent them on a mission into the world and said, "As the Father sent me, so I continue to send you." How did the Father send Jesus into the world? The Father sent Jesus into the world to offer forgiveness, not judgment, to offer healing, not harm, to include those who were deemed as others, not to exclude them. Which leads us back to doubting Thomas. When Jesus came to Thomas, he told Thomas to put his hand in his side where the Roman soldier pierced Jesus with the spear as Jesus hung on the cross. Have you seen the Caravaggio painting of this moment with Thomas, anyone? It's beautiful. Jesus takes Thomas's hand and places his finger at his side. Jesus essentially says to Thomas in this moment, "Do you see this wound? Do you feel this wound? This happened. And yes, you had a part to play in it because you abandoned me, but I don't hold it against you. I love you, and I believe in you." After Thomas put his hand in Jesus' side, Thomas responds, "My Lord and my God." And I don't know exactly what those words mean, but at the very least they mean this. The resurrected Jesus reveals who God is at the most fundamental level. And there is no hint of wrath within the resurrected Jesus. There is no hint of revenge. God is not out to get anyone or send anyone to hell. You can doubt any of those depictions of a wrathful God because Jesus reveals that God seeks to restore us back to the fullness of life, not by wrath or anger, but by offering radical forgiveness and radical love. I want you to know that I'm not making this up. I want you to know that doubts about hell are actually really, really old. We often think that the idea that God sends people to hell after they die was the only teaching of the ancient church. Thus, we tend to think that universal salvation is a modern heresy. But that's false. There were countless ancient theologians who taught some form of universal salvation. For example, the year 375 lived a man named Gregory of Nyssa. Gregory was one of the most important theologians of the early church. He was ultra-Orthodox. You may be surprised to know that he claimed that after Jesus was killed on Good Friday, he descended into hell. Gregory essentially tells the story about Jesus in hell like this. The ruler of hell was the devil, but the devil thought that the dead Jesus was just another human being, and so the devil opened the gates of hell and let Jesus into his domain. But Jesus brought with him the light of God as he entered hell. The light of God was so bright that it acted as a cleansing and purifying agent. And so incapable of enduring the divine presence, the divine light, the devil was overcome and defeated, and hell was destroyed. That's the year 375 people are writing like this. Many ancient Christians believe that the resurrected Jesus conquered hell. Jesus turned hell into heaven. And so I'm convinced that we no longer have to live in fear like the disciples in our stories this morning. We don't have to live in fear of hell when we die. And yet, even though Jesus conquered hell, it's true that Jesus talks about hell more than anyone else in the Bible. It's true that Jesus warns us about hell. But here's the point. When Jesus talks about hell, he uses a specific word. That word is Gehenna. It's important to know that Gehenna was a literal, physical place just outside the city of Jerusalem. Gehenna was the place where ancient kings of Israel sacrificed their children in ritual pits of fire to a god named Molech. Gehenna, hell for Jesus, was a literal place of fire and death. Gehenna was not a place created by God. It was a place created by human beings. And so when Jesus talks about hell, he was not talking about a place you go after you die. He was talking about a literal place here and now created by people. He was talking about the countless ways that we create hell on earth right now. For example, the war in Syria, that's hell. Racism, hell. Economic injustice, that's hell. Political corruption is hell. Treating immigrants and refugees as subhuman is hell. Lack of health care, that's hell. Drone strikes, that's hell. Gun violence and mass shootings, that's hell. Continued lack of drinking water in places like Flint, Michigan, that's putting people through hell. Abusive clergy, yeah, that's hell. Abusive parents are hell. An abusive spouse, that's hell. Believing the lie that God has turned against us, that is hell. The lack of political will to do anything about climate change will lead us and God's good earth straight into a hell of our own making. These are all examples of the hells that we create on earth, and I'm sure that we can find many more. But friends, there is good news. Amid the hells that we create here on earth, we are not alone. For Jesus descends with us. Jesus has been to hell, and Jesus knows the way out. My favorite image of Jesus is a 10th century painting. It shows Jesus descending into hell. Jesus broke down the gates, conquered it, and takes the first man named Adam by his hand and pulls Adam out, and thus pulls out all of humanity with him. The resurrected Jesus took doubting Thomas by the hand so that he would believe the peace and love of God. In the same way, the resurrected Jesus comes to you. He takes you by the hand when you are in your hell. Sometimes Jesus might sit with us in our hell and hold our hand. Sometimes he takes us by the hand and drags us out of our hells. And sometimes Jesus needs a little help. That's where we come in. Jesus needs us to be his hands and his feet for one another. And you have been that for me during the last year and a half that I've been here. I've been through my own little hells in the last year, and you have reminded me that I am not alone. When I first came here, 2 of my best friends died within 3 months of each other. And you entered that hell with me. I've had family members suffer from physical and mental health issues, and you have entered that hell with me. And extended family members have turned their backs on me, calling me blasphemous. You entered that hell with me by laughing with me. You entered that hell with me, and I am forever grateful for you, because you have shown me the love and the light of Christ that descends into hell with us and brings us out. And so may we continue to be Christ's hands and feet for one another, even as we go through hell with each other. Amen.
Hi everyone, this is Adam Erickson, reminding you that no matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you are welcome at Clackamas United Church of Christ. We are located at 15303 Southeast Webster Road in Milwaukee, Oregon. We are so glad that you found this podcast. All of our podcasts will always be free, but we rely on the financial support of our members and our friends. If this podcast meant something to you, you can help us out in 2 ways. You can share this podcast with someone you think might be interested. You can also help us financially by donating to the wonderful missions we have here at Clackamas United Church of Christ. To do so, you can go to our Facebook page, our website, or our YouTube channel, and click on the Donate Here button. Our worship services start at 10:30 on Sundays, except for during the summer months when we start at 10 o'clock. If you would like more information on our church, you can visit our website at c-ucc.org. You can also reach out to me through email at adam@c-ucc.org. Until next time, grace and peace be with you.